Great. Thanks, Deanne. I'd like to start by acknowledging all the lands on which we meet today, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present, and my respects to all Aboriginal people in the meeting today. So welcome everybody. Today we've got a lot of people with us, which is great. I think there's almost 200 people joining, and we've got representatives from the SHS sector as well as from DCJ, from both our district commissioning and planning teams, and then here in central office. And there'll also be some central office staff today who will be helping facilitate the webinar. So the purpose of the information session today is to walk through the standard agreement for funding of services, so more commonly known as the Human Service Agreement. So some of you may or may not be familiar with the HSA, and service providers have been gradually transitioning over to the HSA from the previous funding deed and program level agreement, with the bulk already transitioning from July this year. So you may be familiar with the HSA if you also have some TEI contracts, for example. From July next year, specialist homelessness service contracts will also be transitioned to the new agreement. And the aim of the HSA is really to make it easier for providers to work with the New South Wales government using a streamlined and standardised contract. Program details may vary, but the terms and conditions remain consistent. So some providers may also be using the HSA for some SHS contracts that may have transitioned early, or for other programs as mentioned. So I might just go to the next slide, please, Pooja. Thank you. So what does this mean for SHS recommissioning? So the HSA schedule will be specific to each service. The standard terms will remain standard, as the name implies, and the SHS program guidelines will now form the program specifications. Once HSA contracts have been issued, your local district commissioning and planning teams will work in partnership with you in organisations to negotiate and finalise the contracts. And we're also going to be circulating a draft SHS HSA template schedule this month to allow some time for you all in the sector to review and provide any feedback on the intended content. I also just wanted to also note that any feedback that was provided as part of the TEI process and as part of the HSA review that DCJ were undertaking has been incorporated into the SHS version of the HSA template. And I think the next slide, please, Pooja. Thank you. And so the draft SHS HSA schedule will include draft key milestones for implementing readiness activities and progressively refining service models within the contract term. Some aspects of the template are going to require some further review once the state budget is handed down on the 17th of November, prior to the individual service-specific HSAs being issued to support contract negotiations. So I'm now going to hand over to Lynn to walk through the HSA template. So I did just want to sort of flag that, again, the purpose of today is to walk through the standard template, and for any specifics around SHS recommissioning, there'll be some more information that is circulated to the sector once the state budget is handed down next week. Great. So thank you all, and I'll hand over to Lynn.
Hello there, everybody. Good morning. My name is Lynn Tronzo, and I work in the Procurement and Contracts team, which is part of the Procurement and Funding Administration team that sits under Partnerships, and we're otherwise known as PAFA. Look, before I commence the presentation, I'd like to let you know that there'll be a Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we will endeavour to answer any questions that you may have about the HSA presentation specifically. Any questions that we aren't able to respond to during the presentation, we'll take on notice, and we'll provide you with an FAQ after that presentation. So most of you should already be familiar with the HSA agreement, but for those of you who aren't and haven't come across it yet, it's a New South Wales government document that sets out the standard terms and conditions applying to all non-government organisations funded by New South Wales government agencies, to deliver human services. So the Human Services Agreement, which is how it's colloquially known, and known as the HSA for short as well, is made up of several parts which must be read together as one. Firstly, the Agreement for Funding of Services Standard Terms is your first document. Secondly, the Agreement for Funding of Services Schedule is the second. And thirdly, if any attachments that are attached to the agreement, and this includes any program specifications, for example, which is what we used to formally refer to as program guidelines. So on the next slide, the HSA was created and is owned by the New South Wales Procurement Board. It was designed to make it easier for organisations to enter into funding agreements with New South Wales Government. The idea was to create a standard agreement that was operational across all New South Wales Government agencies, and that's the standard terms that I referred to earlier. And that's to provide consistency and outline the terms and conditions associated with entering into a funding agreement with New South Wales Government specifically for the delivery of human services. So this is why the standard terms is unable to be changed without Procurement Board approval. And since the launch of the HSA in 2017, DCJ has worked hard to transition most NGOs across to the HSA, so some of you might already be familiar with the document. On the next slide, there are a few exceptions where the HSA does not apply. You can see some of those there. This includes when New South Wales government agencies contract with each other for the delivery of those human services. So, for example, where DCJ funds agencies like New South Wales Health or Education to deliver human services programs. Also, small value grants, social benefit bonds, leasing agreements are also exempt. DCJ also receives an exemption for the Permanent Support Program, known as PSP, and this is because the program was being recontracted at the same time that the HSA was being implemented. So those PSP contracts are due to be recontracted using the HSA in 2022. Does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay. All right, well, let's move on to the next slide then. Look, as discussed, the standard terms, if we could move on to the next slide. Thank you. Just one more slide over, please.
Can I just ask what slide number you'd like to be on, Lynn?
Yep, this one here. Yep, which should be 11. Yep. So as discussed, the standard terms were designed to create consistency and uniformity, which is why they're unable to be changed. So the standard terms acts as a header agreement in the funding arrangement between the NGO and New South Wales Government. And that sets out the overarching standard conditions in the same way that the funding deed used to do. So the next slide over, which is slide 12, we'll look at what the differences are between the funding deed and the standard terms. Effectively, what has changed and why. In truth, the two documents are pretty similar. This is a quick visual capture of what the funding agreement looks like and what it used to look like and what it looks like now under the HSA. So as discussed, the standard terms does what the funding deed used to do, and the schedule covers the service-specific elements of the agreement, much like the PLA and the Service Description Schedule, or the SDS, as it was known. So as basically these two documents, they go together as one agreement and must be sent together as a whole anytime you're seeking to execute an agreement. It should be noted one is not an attachment to the other because they actually are two parts of the one agreement. The other difference is that program specifications are now attached to the schedule. So I should add that this is only where service specifications are required because not all programs will have program specifications. But the point to remember is that if you do have service specifications, they must be attached to the schedule because they now form part of the agreement. So this means that they must be sent as part of the package when executing an agreement. And we'll touch a little bit more on service specifications a little bit later. Any questions at this point? Okay. If we could go back one slide, Pooja, I think there was a slide that we missed there that just talked about the differences. Yeah. So what are the differences between the funding deed and the standard terms? Look, in truth, the documents are pretty similar. The two biggest differences would be that the funding deed only outlined service providers' obligations, whereas the standard terms, as part of the HSA, also outlines obligations for government agencies as well. The other big difference is that, unlike the funding deed, the standard terms does not require a signature. So only the HSA's service schedule requires a signature, and that's because the standard terms are a uniform document, but it's the service schedule that is tailored to individual services. So that's the document that gets signed. Okay, if we could move to slide 14, so 2 across.
Do you want some of the? I've got some.
Sorry, Liz,
I think we've got a few people who aren't muted.
Yeah, someone's not on mute. Thank you.
That's okay. All right, so look, now I'd like to talk a little bit about the HSA schedule. So each New South Wales government agency is able to tailor the schedule for its own business purposes, but remember that the standard terms do not change. Some agencies have chosen, and by that I mean some government agencies, have chosen to simply use the stock standard statewide schedule template, which can be found on the Buy New South Wales website. However, DCJ has chosen to create its own DCJ specific HSA schedule, and that's tailored to its individual business needs. So the schedule details the specifics of what each funded service has been contracted to deliver, such as your service type, your geographical coverage, your client groups, your outcomes. And most program areas within DCJ will have tailored this again and created their own program-specific HSA schedule template. For example, something that you'll notice in the HSA that is for the SHS. So it's important to keep this in mind too, that every not only does DCJ have its own specific template, but each program area has tweaked it to tailor to their business. Okay, so the next slide, because DCJ has tailored its own schedule. Thank you. The generic statewide template is not to be used when contracting with DCJ. So I can't stress that enough. So the generic statewide template that you find on the Buy New South Wales website is not relevant for DCJ. And that is, like I said, because DCJ has its own version of it. So an important reason that the generic template is not to be used, and the distinction between the generic template and the HSA that DCJ has created is some specific supplementary conditions that DCJ has incorporated into the template. So some of these supplementary conditions were designed to ensure that terms which existed in the previous funding deed and PLA are also reflected in the new HSA. So they are very specific to our department, to our agency, and we've created those to ensure that it is more tailored to the business for us, and that's why we've tried to incorporate as much of the funding deed and PLA terms that are still relevant into the new HSA. So it's really another really important thing to understand about these specific supplementary conditions is that they actually have the power to override the standard terms, and because of this, they cannot be changed without DCJ's General Counsel approval. So again, this is to ensure consistency across agreements. If we have a look at the next slide over, these are some examples of some of these supplementary conditions that I'm referring to. So as a general rule, like I said, I can't stress this enough, these supplementary conditions really should not be amended. So some of these, you're looking at trying to create some consistency in notice periods, for example. That's one of the main ones in the standard terms clause 13, where the supplementary condition has actually overridden the notice periods that it currently exist in the standard terms. So if you've got to read these two documents together, and whatever the supplementary conditions state will override what's in the standard terms. Okay, so moving along, what are program specifications? If we have a look at the next slide. So I touched on this earlier and clarified that effectively what we now term as program specifications used to be known as program guidelines. So why the change? Well, that's because the key difference is that program guidelines were just that, they were a guide, and they sat alongside the funding deed and the PLA. The difference now is that service specifications actually form part of the contract as an attachment. And it's important to note that any document that's attached to the HSA becomes part of the agreement. The significance of this is that any changes that need to be made to any of the attachments during the course of the agreement will require a variation to that agreement. So it's important for contract managers to determine what needs to sit within the agreement as an attachment and what documents need to sit outside of it. And documents that don't need to form part of the agreement can simply be attached to the cover letter rather than the agreement itself. So any questions at that point?
Yeah, I've got one question. We have only in the last couple of weeks been going through new guidelines for SHS, and now this says program specifications. What's the point of doing guidelines at the moment?
Laurie, you'll have to excuse me. That is probably more a question for your program area rather than more of a generic kind of HSA question. So if you'd like, we will note that and park that and put that to the program area, and then we can have them respond to you in relation to the guidelines.
Thanks.
But the guidelines, I can speak generically about guidelines and what we now term as program specifications, and what they are is more they provide a more tailored understanding of how the program is to be delivered. So that's something that the supplementary conditions are generic across the department as a whole, and your program specifications are generally more tailored to the program area itself, just to give you that generic stuff. But your question will be noted, and more specific information will come to you from the program area.
Excuse me, Lynn, it's Deanne here.
Yes.
Steve DeReeve might be able to just provide a bit of information. Steve, did you have your hand up?
Thanks, Deanne. Thanks, Laurie, for the question. Just wanted to quickly clarify that the program guidelines, the SHS program guidelines currently with the sector for consultation will effectively become what's known as program specifications under the HSA. So whilst they're currently core guidelines, they've been called, program practice guidelines for several years. They'll be relabeled, if you like, into what we will call under the HSA program specifications. Hope that clarifies for you, Laurie.
And Lynn, Veronica McDonald has her hand up.
Veronica.
Yes. Just a question in regards to the program specification. If any variation during the contract period needs to be changed, what I'm sure it will be a process. Do you think that will be a long process, short process, don't know, depending?
Look, at most program specifications, if there are some of the terms within the individual program specifications will provide more clarity on what will take place should there be any amendments to those program specifications during the course of the agreement. So what you're likely to have is a term, for example, in the program's specification, what the program guideline as it's currently called under SHS, but will be known as program specs, that will say something along the lines of that will allow for changes and evolution of those program specifications throughout the course of the agreement without having to worry about variations, but that does depend on the nature of those changes and amendments. As a general rule, any changes to the schedule itself will require a variation, and that's not not too arduous a process. That's a simple letter that will require signing by both parties just to acknowledge the change. And should there be, more complex amendments to the program specifications, then you would anticipate that there would be something similar for that.
Thank you. That's very, thank you.
You're welcome. No other questions?
No other questions there, Lynn.
Okay, well, that's it from me. Thank you so much.
Sorry, just pausing again. Angela Firmano has a question. I'm just wondering, when you do have a question, if you wouldn't mind just mentioning where you're from, that'd be great. Thanks very much. Over to Angela.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Yes.
Angela Firmano from Mission Australia. Lynn, just to following on from what you just said. So the only variations can come about from or are to be reflected within the schedule or the program guidelines. I'm assuming then that the actual standard terms can't be amended within the schedule or the program guidelines. So those standard terms are set in stone and there's no ability to change those.
Yeah, the general position is that standard terms are not able to be amended, and as I mentioned earlier, the reason for that is to create uniformity across all agencies with that document, because that was the whole purpose of creating the HSA in the first instance, so that organisations like yours that have multiple contracts across multiple agencies across multiple program areas will know the basic premise of the requirements, the obligations, and responsibilities of those funding agreements. So you've got one stock standard, document. That's the idea. However, as I also mentioned earlier, with supplementary conditions, given that there is a clause within the standard terms that outlines the order of precedence, supplementary conditions do have the power to override, as we did when I showed you that slide on the standard terms 13.2, that we do have the power to have that ability for supplementary conditions to override certain clauses of the standard terms, but that is very rare, and it is a process that requires legal's involvement, etc. So PAFA will be involved in that. Legal will be consulted as well.
That's great. Thanks, Lynn.
Yeah, no problem.
No other questions currently there, Lynn.
Okay, well, that's it from me. Thank you so much for coming along. What a great attendance.
We just want to provide, there's a slide, I think, on resourcing that might be
true. That's a
couple of slides. We had a Q&A slide, but we were having just a bit of trouble loading that up, so it might just skip to resourcing. So did you want to go over those aspects there, Lynn?
Yeah, look, this slide will be provided to you, so you'll have these as a reference. A good place to look is the DCJ website that has a page specifically on the HSA, and there's some good resources there that our team has put together. Justice Connect is also a great resource, and that's to a support that they can provide to NGOs to better understand and navigate the HSA, and there's a link there for that. Yeah, look, you're going to be sent through a copy of the document, so you can have it, a better conversation with your contract manager specifically around that, and then of course any issues with the SHS program itself, there's the email address for you there.
And just to provide, if we can, Lynn, just a final opportunity for any other questions that are top of mind for those online today.
Absolutely.
If you've got a question, you can either pop that or put your hand up.
Okay.
You're not seeing anything there. So a big thanks to you, Lynn, today for sharing your knowledge. That's been really helpful. And just to recap that we have recorded the session, so we will upload this session and send out an email with the link to that. As Lynn said, we will also be able to produce a brief Q&A following the session. But thank you so much, everyone, for your time. We really appreciate that, understand you're very busy, and thanks for coming online today. Thanks again. Bye.
Thank you.